Thank you, Comrade David North, and greetings to everyone listening to this lecture internationally. The events of February 1917 in Russia marked the beginning of revolutionary convulsions that changed the course of history. On February 22nd, the eve of the revolution, Nicholas II was the emperor and autocrat of all Russia. A week later, the seemingly invincible Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for more than 300 years, was overthrown, replaced by the unstable dual power of the bourgeois Provisional Government and the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. This was the framework of the political conflicts that developed over the next 8 months, leading up to the conquest of political power by the working class under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party in October. In beginning our examination of the Revolution of 1917, we must again review the way in which the issue of the Russia question, or the Russian Revolution, was understood and analyzed by the revolutionary movement. Really, only in this context is it possible to understand the political and social conflicts that developed during the momentous events of 1917. We must recall the basic principle of Marxism, that social revolution, that is the process of replacing one ruling elite or one ruling class with another, takes place only when the development of the productive forces is no longer possible within the framework of the existing relations of production. Scientific socialism is not rooted in utopian fantasies, but in the objective contradictions of capitalism, and bound up with this, the social interests of the working class. As we consider the world situation today, it is clear that the capitalist nation-state system has become an enormous barrier to the further development of production, indeed the future of humanity itself. However, Marxism began to take root in Russia under conditions in which the level of social and economic development considered necessary for a socialist movement, in particular the predominance of capitalist property relations and a mass working class, was at a very low level. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, the peasantry still comprised 85% of the population of Russia, and for the most part they were toiling in ignorance and poverty. Despite the formal emancipation of the serfs in 1861, land ownership was dominated by the large landlords. Old feudal relations, which had been abolished in Western Europe in the great bourgeois revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, remained. Politically, the Tsarist autocracy dominated the country, and there were no real mechanisms of democratic and parliamentary forms of rule as existed in Western Europe and the United States. This meant that the immediate tasks facing the revolutionary movement in Russia were of a bourgeois democratic character. The father of Russian Marxism, Georgi Plekhanov, was the first to recognize that the working class of Russia, despite its relatively small size in comparison to the peasantry, was in fact the decisive revolutionary force in the democratic revolution. Quote, "The revolutionary movement in Russia will triumph only as a workers' movement, or it will never triumph at all," he proclaimed at the founding Congress of the Second International in 1889. His conception was that of a revolution in two stages, in which the working class would play the leading role in the democratic revolution, but power would necessarily be transferred in some manner to the bourgeoisie, allowing for a more or less extended period of capitalist development before the working class was strong enough to take power itself. Comrade North and Volkov note in their important essay on Plekhanov published late last year on the World Socialist website that, quote, "Plekhanov's outstanding role as a political thinker lay in the fact that he foresaw the decisive role of the working class long before it emerged as a mass social group occupying a specific place in economic and political life, and under conditions in which capitalism in Russia had taken only its first steps," end quote. Indeed, this basic and far-sighted conception lay at the foundation of the subsequent development of the entire Marxist movement in Russia. The further steps of Russian capitalism, however, raised critical issues of perspective that exposed the weaknesses and consequences of Plekhanov's two-stage conception. The 1905 revolution, as we saw in the lecture by Comrade Fred Williams a month ago, not only demonstrated the enormous social power of the working class, but also the counter-revolutionary role of the bourgeoisie. In 1905, Plekhanov, now associated with the Menshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, wrote that the revolution was bourgeois in character, which meant that it did not, quote, signify the undermining of capitalism, but rather would clear the soil for the first time and in a real way for a broad and swift, for a European and not Asiatic development of capitalism, making possible, quote, for the first time the rule of the bourgeoisie as a class. That was to be the task of the revolution. But how would it be possible to transfer power to a class that did not want it, was terrified of the class that was actually the main driving force of the revolution, that is, the working class? For the working class, the logic of this perspective meant that it had to refrain from advancing its own interests for fear of frightening the bourgeoisie and driving it into the camp of reaction. As we will see, the program and perspective would be developed, this program and perspective would be developed by the Mensheviks along with the Socialist Revolutionary Party following the February Revolution itself. The perspective of Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, was very different. The Russian Revolution was to be a bourgeois democratic revolution, he argued, but the fundamental tasks of the revolution would and could not be carried out by the bourgeoisie or in alliance with the bourgeoisie. The most important task, Lenin stressed, of the bourgeois democratic revolution was the liquidation of feudal relations in the countryside. However, in Russia, the bourgeoisie was unable and unwilling to carry out this task. In response to Plekhanov's statements in 1905 that it was necessary to be careful not to repel the non-proletarian parties by tactless actions, in the words of Plekhanov, Lenin replied that, quote, the liberals and the landlords will forgive you millions of tactless acts, but will not forgive you a summons to take away the land. Lenin advanced instead a program of overthrowing the Tsarist autocracy through what he called the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, with the term dictatorship here used in the Marxist sense of state power. The working class would take power in alliance with the peasantry and against the landlords and the big bourgeoisie and implement the most radical democratic measures. However, this revolution would not and could not transcend the framework of capitalist property relations by itself. Social democracy has consistently stressed the bourgeois nature of the impending revolution in Russia, Lenin wrote in 1905, and insisted on a clear line of demarcation between the democratic minimum program and the socialist maximum program. Obviously, he added, the historical course of events has now posed before the Russian proletariat precisely the task of carrying through the democratic bourgeois revolution. This task confronts the people as a whole, the entire mass of the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry. Without such a revolution, the more or less extensive development of an independent class organization for the socialist revolution is unthinkable. Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution rejected the two-stage theory of Plekhanov, as well as the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry proposed by Lenin. Trotsky recognized that the basic tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution had yet to be completed. The unevenness of capitalist development was expressed in the relative backwardness of Russian economy and society. However, into this backwardness, class relations of a highly advanced character were introduced as a result of the interaction of the Russian economy with the world economy. Rather than an organic growth of capitalism that involved the development of broad layer of petty bourgeois and small craftsmen, Trotsky wrote in 1906, Quote, capital intruded from the West with the direct cooperation of absolutism. In a short period converted a number of old archaic towns into centers of trade and industry, and even created, in a short time, commercial and industrial towns in places that had previously been absolutely uninhabited. Trotsky later referred to this phenomena as the law of combined development, quote, a drawing together of the different stages of the journey, a combining of the separate steps, an amalgam of archaic with more contemporary forms. This combined and uneven character of Russian development determined the social physiognomy and political orientation of different classes. The speed and concentration of industrial development imparted to the working class struggle a particularly explosive character. As for the bourgeoisie, the severity of the class struggle meant that Russian liberalism was perpetually terrified that the development of a revolutionary movement against the Tsar would spark a working class movement against private ownership. The bourgeoisie, moreover, was thoroughly dependent on foreign capital and therefore European imperialism. It was constantly fleeing into the arms of the Tsar and seeking an alliance with the landed autocracy. In fact, this phenomenon could already be seen in somewhat different form in Europe during the revolutions of 1848. The revolutionary movements in Hungary, Germany, and Austria in the middle of the 19th century were characterized by a high level of working class struggle, and the bourgeoisie, fearing this revolution, allied with reaction. No struggle can be successful, the German revolutionary Ferdinand Lassalle wrote to Marx in 1849, quote, if social questions enter into it only as a sort of hazy element and remain in the background, and if it is carried out under the banner of national regeneration or bourgeois republicanism. It was in their 1850 report to the Central Authority of the Communist League that Marx and Engels first used the phrase revolution and permanence to refer to working class opposition to the, quote, hypocritical phrases of the democratic petty bourgeois that preaches, quote, general unity and reconciliation, in which the definite demands of the proletariat must not be brought forward for the sake of beloved peace, end quote. Now, the level of class conflict in Russia a half-century later was far greater, and the revolutionary appetite of the bourgeoisie far less than it was in 1848 in Europe, let alone 1789, at the time of the Great French Revolution. The overthrow of the Tsar and the resolution of the democratic tasks fell to the working class of Russia, which would necessarily leave behind it the peasant masses. In opposition to Lenin, Trotsky insisted that once the working class took power, it could not constrain itself to purely bourgeois democratic tasks, but would be compelled to make inroads into capitalist property relations, to begin introducing socialism. Having taken state power, what program would the working class implement? Even if it were to establish a state in alliance with the peasantry, how would the party of the working class respond to unemployment and food shortages, or to strikes by workers or lockouts by employers? Writing in 1909, he criticized Lenin for believing that, quote, the contradictions between the proletariat's class interests and objective conditions, that is, the backwardness of Russia, will be resolved by the proletariat imposing a political limitation upon itself by exercising a class asceticism. Quote, whereas the Mensheviks, Trotsky wrote, proceeding from the abstract notion that our revolution is a bourgeois revolution, arrive at the idea that the proletariat must adopt all its tactics to the behavior of the liberal bourgeoisie in order to ensure this transfer of state power to that bourgeoisie. The Bolsheviks proceed from an equally abstract notion, democratic dictatorship, not socialist dictatorship, and arrive at the idea of a proletariat in possession of state power imposing a bourgeois democratic limitation upon itself. It is true that the difference between them is a matter very considerable, Trotsky concluded. While the anti-revolutionary aspects of Menshevism have already become fully apparent, those of Bolshevism are likely to become a serious threat only in the event of victory. The revolution in Russia, Trotsky insisted, could only be led by the working class, and having taken power, the working class would be compelled to introduce measures of a socialist character. This was one sense in which the revolution would be permanent. But how was this possible in backward Russia? How could the most advanced forms of social relations be introduced in a country that was so economically underdeveloped, comprised of the most part of peasants? The key to resolving this dilemma lay in understanding Russia and the Russian Revolution not as an isolated national event, but as a component part of an international revolution. Binding all countries together with its mode of production and its commerce, capitalism has converted the whole world into a single economic and political organism, Trotsky wrote in the midst of the 1905 revolution. This immediately gives the events now unfolding an international character and opens up a wide horizon. The political emancipation of Russia, led by the working class, will raise that class to a height as yet unknown in history, will transfer to it colossal power and resources, and will make it the initiator of the liquidation of world capitalism, for which history has created all the objective conditions. The passage of 12 years between 1905 and the outbreak of the February Revolution only confirmed Trotsky's analysis. On the bloody battlefields of Europe, the fate of workers of every country were bound together. The Great War, the colossal breakdown of the nation-state system, also marked the end of all national programs. It placed on the order of the day the socialist reorganization of world economy. This was another sense in which the revolution had to be permanent. Writing in the midst of the mass international slaughter, Trotsky explained, "A national bourgeois revolution in Russia is impossible because of the absence of a genuinely revolutionary bourgeois democracy. The time for national revolutions is past, in Europe anyway, and so is the time for national wars. There is a deep interconnection between the two. We are living in the era of imperialism, which means not only a system of colonial expansion, but also a very distinctive type of domestic regime. It is no longer a matter of a bourgeois nation opposing the old regime, but of the proletariat opposing the bourgeois nation." This perspective provided the essential strategic foundation of the Bolshevik Party between April and October, but not before an internal struggle led by Lenin, to which I will return later in this lecture. It is within this perhaps extended introduction that we examine the events of February 1917 and the Russian Revolution as a whole. Russia's development during this year, and indeed the subsequent nationalist and Stalinist degeneration of the Soviet Union, provided powerful confirmation in different forms of the correctness of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. While more information has been uncovered by historians over the past 80 years, and there are a number of valuable works on the February Revolution in particular, the best account of the Russian Revolution as a whole remains Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. If the main consequence of this lecture is to encourage more people to read this book, I would consider it a success. The most immediate fact about the February Revolution, as was with the Revolution of 1905, is that its principal motive force was the working class, and particularly the working class of Petrograd. Even prior to February 23rd, the class struggle in Russia was escalating under the impact of the war and desperate economic conditions. While the number of striking workers had fallen from 1.3 million in January-July 1914, that is just prior to the outbreak of the war, it fell to under 10,000 from August through December of that year. The number of strikes rose to more than 500,000 in 1915 and nearly 1 million in 1916. In the weeks leading up to the February Revolution of 1917, the number of strikes expanded rapidly, including 186,000 workers who participated in a strike to mark the anniversary of the 1905 Bloody Sunday Massacre, as well as the lockout of 25,000 workers at the Putilov factory in Petrograd on February 22nd, the largest factory in the city. The strikes were becoming increasingly political in character, demanding an end to the monarchy and an end to war. The revolution itself began with the eruption of protests and walkouts by workers in the heavily industrialized Vyborg district, where the Bolshevik Party in particular had a principal base of support. On February 23rd, International Women's Day, and this was March 8th on the Western calendar. I should note that throughout this lecture, in describing the events of February and the revolution, I will be using the old-style calendar rather than the Western calendar. So according to that calendar, the revolution began on February 23rd. On that day, women textile workers in the Vyborg district, fed up with long work hours, the unending war, food shortages, and bread lines, met in the morning and walked off the job. They appealed to their fellow workers in neighboring factories, which included large metalworking plants, to join them. It's important to note that many of these women workers would have brothers or family members or husbands who had been sent off to war. Opposition to war was deeply felt throughout the working class of Petrograd. One worker in the New Lesner factory, a machine construction plant in the Vyborg district, and one of the largest factories in Petrograd at the time, described what followed. Quote, "Women's voices were heard in the alley onto which the windows of our department opened, shouting, 'Down with the war! Down with the high cost of living! Down with hunger! Bread for the workers!' Throngs of militant workers, women workers, filled the alley. Those who spotted us began waving their arms and yelling, 'Come out! Stop work!' Snowballs pelted the windows. We decided to join the demonstration." Though the policy of the Bolshevik Party central leadership at the time was not to call for strike action, the Vyborg Committee, that is the local committee of the Bolshevik Party in the Vyborg district, met and decided to support the strike. Similar decisions were taken at other factories involving workers associated with the Mensheviks or the Socialist Revolutionary Parties, as well as the Bolsheviks. More than 100,000 workers, or about a third of the industrial workforce, were on strike by the end of the day. The next day, February 24th, was a Friday, and the strike expanded to encompass half of all the industrial workers, more than 200,000, and began to expand beyond the Vyborg district. The gigantic factories, the centers of industrial production, including war production, became the centers of revolutionary activity and agitation. This day also saw the beginning of confrontations between workers and the police. The military, significantly, however, it had not yet been ordered to shoot on soldiers, and there were initial signs of fraternization between workers and soldiers. On the third day, Saturday, February 25th, the strike expanded and became practically general. Nearly 250,000 workers participated. The police played a leading role in suppressing strikes and demonstrations, and conflicts began to develop between the soldiers and the soldiers of the city and the police. In one incident, Cossack soldiers not only refused to assist police who were breaking up a demonstration, but in fact attacked the police and killed their commander. Tsar Nicholas II ordered Kabalov, the commander of the Petrograd military district, to take more drastic action to suppress the rebellion that could endanger the war effort. "I order you to bring all these demonstrations in the capital to a halt as of tomorrow. These cannot be permitted in this difficult time of war with Germany and Austria." It's important to note the way in which the question of the war was dominant in the considerations of the actions of the autocracy, including in relationship to the development of domestic unrest. Kabalov responded with an order forbidding gatherings in the streets. Arrests were made in the evening, including of 5 members of the Petrograd Committee of the Bolsheviks, with direct guidance of the Bolsheviks falling to the Vyborg district organization. The fourth day was a Sunday, February 26th, and the factories were closed. Yet demonstrations continued, with Kabalov following Nicholas's orders with bloody violence. Mobilizing more reliable military units, including the training squads composed of non-commissioned officers, he ordered troops to fire into the crowds. Hundreds were killed, thousands wounded. In the evening of that day, the 26th, a momentous event occurred that would foreshadow what would happen the following day. The Pavlovsky Regiment of the Imperial Guard revolted, angered at the firing on workers by their own training squad. On the morning of the 27th, the soldiers' revolt began with the mutiny of the Volinsky Regiment. They fired on and killed their commander, who had ordered them to shoot workers the previous day. The mutineers went out to nearby regiments and encouraged revolt. One by one, the separate barracks joined the revolution. Attempts by the Tsar's commanders to assemble loyal troops failed. The workers' insurrection expanded. Government buildings were taken over and political prisoners liberated. Before going on to the political conditions that emerged out of these events, I'd like to take up the question of who led the February Revolution. As Comrade North indicated in the introduction, it's not a question of so-called politically innocent workers. There was certainly no centralized political party that directed events throughout the 5 days from February 23rd to February 27th. The Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries neither anticipated nor wanted a working class revolution. During the February events, leading members of these organizations were in the Duma, pleading with the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois parties to take action lest the situation develop out of control. The Mezhoriantsy, the inter-district group with which Trotsky, exiled in New York, was associated, issued a leaflet on the second day of the revolution calling for a democratic republic, socialism, an end to the war, and the creation of the provisional revolutionary government. However, it did not have the same mass base as the Bolsheviks did, particularly in Vyborg. Lower-level Bolshevik organizations played a significant role, particularly the Vyborg District Committee, as I've mentioned. However, the party and central leadership was perpetually behind events. And the leadership in the city, in fact, was under constant pressure from worker activists within the Bolshevik Party to respond more aggressively, to issue leaflets, to call for a general strike, an insurrection. During the February events, most of the Bolshevik leadership itself was in exile, including Lenin, who was in Switzerland, from where he did not return until April. This does not mean, however, that the revolution was purely spontaneous. A mystic theory that Trotsky notes, quote, fell in most opportunely with the minds not only of those gentlemen who had yesterday been peacefully governing, judging, convicting, defending, trading, or commanding, and today were hastening to make up the revolution, but also the many professional politicians and former revolutionists who, having slept through the revolution, wished to think that in this they were not different from all the rest, end quote. There were, in fact, workers who led the revolution. There were workers who were trained and educated through years of socialist propaganda, through the bitter experiences of 1905. They had gone through the strike wave of 1912 through 1914, which threatened revolution prior to the outbreak of war, and during which the Bolshevik Party in particular grew and developed a very broad base of support within the working class. They saw the spinelessness of the liberals. Some may have been influenced or cowed by the nationalist upsurge at the time of the outbreak of war, but they saw what the war had done. Many of these workers would have been strongly influenced by the Bolshevik Party in particular, which, as I said, had been growing in prominence before the outbreak of war. The revolution was led, as Trotsky wrote, by conscious and tempered workers educated for the most part by the party of Lenin. However, this leadership itself, quote, proved sufficient to guarantee the victory of the insurrection, but it was not adequate to transfer immediately into the hands of the proletarian vanguard the leadership of the revolution. So the working class and soldiers of Petrograd had made the revolution, but they were not able to take political power. Instead, a complex and unstable dual power regime emerged, which would exist until the October Revolution 8 months later. On the 27th, with the Tsar still in power, the Duma representatives gathered to discuss how to contain the situation and tame the revolution. They decided to form a provisional committee of the members of the Duma, which issued a statement declaring that it, quote, found itself compelled to take into its own hands the restoration of the state and public order. Contrary to its own subsequent mythologizing, the liberal bourgeoisie represented by the main parties in the Duma played no revolutionary role. It was terrified of the masses, seeking some way to preserve autocratic rule with or without Tsar Nicholas II. Paul Milyakov, leader of the bourgeois Constitutional Democratic Party, the Cadets, later acknowledged, quote, "We did not want this revolution. We did not wish particularly that it would come at the time of the war. We struggled desperately so that this would not happen." Not exactly the statements of a revolutionary leader. However, when their efforts to pressure the Tsar to form a new government failed, and as it became clear that the masses would not accept it, the bourgeoisie's representatives turned to the military high command to force the Tsar's abdication. Discussions, in fact, had already taken place before the revolution between the military and the leaders of the bourgeois parties about the formation of a new government, even the deposing of Nicholas II, to create better conditions for prosecuting the war. This was above all their concern. The Allied imperialist powers, in fact, had indicated some support for such efforts as well. Without the support of the military, the Tsar abdicated on March 2nd, transferring power to his brother, the Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich. The Provisional Government was formed the same day, headed by Prince Lvov, with the intention that it would serve under the new Tsar, but Mikhail himself, fearing for his head, abdicated. The Romanov dynasty was abolished, despite the best intentions of the bourgeois representatives who led the new government. On the same day that the Duma committee was formed in the Taurida Palace, February 27th, and in the same building, in fact, another government body was established, which enjoyed the support of masses of workers and soldiers, the Soviet of Workers Deputies, later the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. Some 250 workers, soldiers, and socialist intellectuals participated in the first meeting on the evening of the 27th. The meeting was called at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 27th, and by 9 o'clock in the evening, the meeting was held, involving 250 representatives of workers from throughout the city, as well as soldiers and intellectuals. The Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, a petty bourgeois party with a base in the peasantry, dominated the leadership of the early Soviet. So you had two governing institutions that emerged out of the February Revolution: the Duma Committee, the Provisional Government, and the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. Now, the phenomenon of dual power was not unique to the Russian Revolution. The existence of two governing institutions had occurred in previous revolutions, as one class was replacing another. Such a situation can only resolve itself in civil war. The dual power regime that emerged after the February Revolution was peculiar, however, in that the leaders of the Soviets, which commanded the support of the workers and soldiers, the driving force of the revolution, worked consciously and deliberately to turn power over to the provisional government, the bourgeois provisional government. The essential class conflict that was concealed in the relationship between the two bodies was to emerge directly only when the Bolsheviks won control of the Soviet several months later, under the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." Masses of workers and soldiers did not look to the Duma for leadership, but to the Soviet. The parties that headed the Soviet, however, did not want power and were unwilling to take measures that would address the workers' and soldiers' demands. The basic democratic and social aspirations of the workers and soldiers who led the revolution collided with the interests of the bourgeoisie, but their representatives, that is, the representatives of the workers and soldiers in the Soviet, insisted that the bourgeoisie must rule. This paradox, Trotsky refers to it as the paradox of dual power in Russia, found expression in different forms. First, there was the issue of power itself and the recognition of the provisional government. Immediately after Tsar Nicholas's abdication, the leaders of the executive committee of the Soviet, predominantly Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, met with the representatives of the Duma to discuss the conditions in which the Soviet would support the new government. Their conditions did not include any of the basic demands of the workers and soldiers: an end to the war, a republic, land, the 8-hour day. They only had one demand: freedom of agitation. That is, they were willing and indeed eager to hand power to the bourgeoisie, to recognize the bourgeois government, so long as the bourgeoisie agreed not to arrest them. Second, and closely related to the issue of power, was that of the arming or disarming of the workers and the workers' militia. In fact, during the revolution, the most militant workers, again concentrated in the Vyborg district, and these would have been workers very much influenced by the Bolshevik Party, had taken the initiative to form militias. There's a photo of one there that you see. The Soviet recognized the established fact of the formation of these workers' militias by seeking to organize the militias under its own authority after the revolutionary events, while the Duma Committee set up a militia of its own. This created the possibility for, in fact, an armed conflict between the two militias, that is, a civil war. As one historian of the February Revolution notes, quote, "Already on February 28th, the Soviet Executive Committee made clear its intention to cooperate with the Duma Committee in solving this conflict by sacrificing the independence of the workers' militias. It worked to unify the two militias, that is, to disarm the workers, or at least to subordinate the workers' militias to the governing authority of the bourgeoisie, consecrated in Executive Committee decisions, the decisions of the Executive Committee of the Soviet on March 1st and March 7th. Third was the issue of return of workers to the factories and the conditions of work. The Executive Committee initially designated March 5th as the date of resuming work, with no change in the conditions of labor in the plants. So workers had just gone on massive strike wave and produced the revolutionary convulsions, and the response of the Executive Committee was there should be a return to work without any agreement on a change in the conditions or wages or work hours at the plant. In particular, they rejected workers' demands for an 8-hour day on the grounds that this would scare off the bourgeoisie, which had to take power. Workers, however, took matters into their own hands, with many in the major industrial plants leaving work en masse after 8 hours. The Manufacturers Association ended up reluctantly accepting the 8-hour day as a matter of necessity, with one of the bourgeois publicists explaining, quote, "Unfortunately for the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks had already, by means of terror, compelled the Manufacturers Association to agree to an immediate introduction of the 8-hour day." End quote. Fourth were relations within the army. The Duma representatives attempted to regain control over the military. This was one of the first tasks which they felt was necessary in the wake of the revolutionary uprising. They ordered soldiers to submit to the discipline of their officers and surrender their arms, which the Soviet leaders supported. The soldiers, however, rejected these efforts, pressuring the Petrograd Soviet to pass on March 1st Order Number 1. It instructed soldiers not to obey any orders from the Duma Committee that contradicted those of the Soviet. It also instructed soldiers to seize control of weapons and to elect committees in each regiment. Order Number 1 was passed when the top leaders of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries were not present. Later, they attempted to reverse it by passing Order Number 2, limiting its application to Petrograd. This effort at reinforcing relations within the military failed, however, and the revolution encouraged an already developing virtual civil war within the military between the soldiers and their officers. Finally, and most importantly, was the overriding matter of the war itself. For the bourgeoisie, the banner was war to complete victory. After ignoring the issue for 2 weeks, the Executive Committee of the Soviet passed a resolution on March 14th, a manifesto to the peoples of the world containing many pacifist phrases, but ultimately pledging support for this program of the bourgeoisie. It wrote, "We will firmly defend our own liberty from all reactionary attempts from within as well as from without. The Russian Revolution will not retreat before the bayonets of the conquerors and will not allow itself to be crushed by foreign military force." End quote. In other words, the war would continue. The resolution was hailed by British imperialism and the bourgeois parties in Russia. Sukhanov, a member of the Executive Committee who had participated in the Zimmerwald anti-war conference in 1915 and in fact had drawn up the resolution on March 14th, the Manifesto to the Peoples of the World, which outlined the pro-war policy of the Soviet, later wrote candidly in his memoirs, quote, "It was evident that the bourgeoisie could have nothing in common with a movement that undermined the idea of war to complete victory. It saw, or at least spoke of, any such movement as simply the result of German provocation. It was clear then a priori that if a bourgeois government and the adherence of the bourgeoisie to the revolution were to be counted on, it was temporarily necessary to shelve the slogans against the war, to furl for a time the banner of Zimmerwald, which had become the banner of the Russian and especially of the Petersburg proletariat. Now, the events, therefore, of February and early March marked only the first stage in the unfolding revolution. The next stage had to be prepared by sharply clarifying the political tasks posed by the new situation. Both Lenin in Switzerland and Trotsky in New York responded with incredible precision in analyzing what had just transpired. Trotsky, in an article published in Novy Mir on March 6th, wrote that, quote, an open conflict between the forces of the revolution headed by the urban proletariat and the anti-revolutionary liberal bourgeoisie temporarily in power is absolutely inevitable. This is on March 6th. On March 3rd, Lenin cabled instructions to Russia, quote, our tactics, complete distrust, no support for the Provisional Government, distrust Kerensky above all, arm the proletariat as the only guarantee. In his first letter from afar, written on March 7th, Lenin wrote that, quote, he who says that the workers must support the new government in the interests of the struggle against Tsarist reaction is a traitor to the workers, a traitor to the cause of the proletariat, to the cause of peace and freedom. For actually precisely this new government is already bound hand and foot by imperialist capital, by the imperial policy of war and plunder. This perspective was developed in Lenin's further letters from afar, in which he outlined a program calling for the transfer of power to the Soviets, immediate end to the war, confiscation of the landed estates by the peasantry, workers' control of production, and the beginning of the transition to socialism. Lenin's positions provoked a major political conflict within the Bolshevik Party in March and April of 1917, in which he fought for a political line that had been associated with Trotsky. In doing so, Lenin had to do battle with sections of the Bolshevik Party itself, in particular a right-wing faction associated with Kamenev, Stalin, and Muranov, who had returned to Petrograd in mid-March and taken over editorial responsibilities for Pravda, seeking to orient the party towards support for the Provisional Government and the war. In this struggle, in fact, Lenin had powerful allies within the Bolshevik Party itself, particularly its working class base. As historian Alexander Rabinovich notes, as early as March 1st, the Vyborg District Committee of the party had, quote, adopted a resolution calling for the immediate seizure of power by the workers and the abolition of the Duma's Provisional Committee. The Bureau of the Central Committee, headed by Shalapnikov, adopted a resolution declaring that the Provisional Government was, quote, a representative of the grand bourgeoisie and the big landowners, and that it was necessary to, quote, initiate a struggle for the creation of a provisional revolutionary government. When this resolution was brought before the Petersburg Committee of the party, however, it was rejected in favor of a resolution stating that the Bolshevik Party, quote, does not oppose a provisional government as long as its policies are consistent with the interests of the people, a formula that mirrored that of the Mensheviks. So divisions emerged and developed within the Bolshevik Party in the aftermath of the February Revolution, which were the framework for conflicts over political perspective and program. I want to address the character of these divisions in the form of a reply to certain historical falsifications that are being advanced and developed in relationship to this period. This period, in fact, as with the Russian Revolution as a whole, has been the subject of relentless falsification by the Stalinists, in particular, as part of the effort to remove Trotsky, the significance of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, from history and to justify their own nationalist and opportunist politics. For serious historians, however, the basic political dynamic of these events in February and its aftermath has been clear. The contradictory character of dual power, the relationship between the Soviets and the Provisional Government, the significance of the divisions within the Bolshevik Party, the impact of Lenin's return in April. However, we are seeing a new and renewed campaign of historical falsification of an essentially neo-Stalinist character. One prominent example of this trend is the historian Lars Lee, who's been heavily promoted by the International Socialist Organization and its publication arm Haymarket. Indeed, this very afternoon, Lee participated in a panel with ISO member Tod Christian at the Historical Materialism Conference in New York on the subject of the divisions within the Bolshevik Party in March, this very topic. In a number of recent articles, Lee argues that there were no fundamental differences within the Bolshevik Party in the months that followed the February Revolution, that there was in fact a seamless continuity between February and October, that dual power is not a useful category in understanding the period between the two revolutions, and incredibly, that the Russian Revolution had nothing to do with socialism. Lee's essay, Fully Armed, Kamenev and Pravda in March 1917, published in 2014, is devoted to arguing that the line of Stalin and Kamenev in March, quote, fully prepared the Bolsheviks for the conquest of power in October. It should be noted that even the headline is very significant, Fully Armed. It's a reference to the argument made by Trotsky in defense of, in Lessons of October, written in 1924, that in analyzing these developments, that Lenin, upon returning in April, rearmed the Bolshevik Party in preparation for October in opposition to the line that had been developed by Kamenev. Lee's argument is that in fact, the Bolshevik Party was fully armed in March, even prior to Lenin's return. It is in fact a direct, although he doesn't frame it in this way, a direct response to Trotsky's analysis. In constructing his narrative, Lee cites only one of the editorials published in Pravda after Kamenev, Muranov, and Stalin returned from exile on March 15th. That editorial, which was unsigned but attributed to Kamenev, states, just as we energetically support the new provisional government in the complete liquidation of the old regime and the monarchy, in the implementation of freedoms, etc., we will just as energetically criticize each failure of the provisional government to act on its declared intentions, each derivation from decisive struggle, each attempt to tie the hands of the people or to put out the raging revolutionary fire. And the most significant passage here is his statement that we energetically support the provisional government in the complete liquidation of the old regime. It is in fact in direct conflict with Lenin's letter from afar, which I quoted, which characterized anyone who called for support for the new government in its struggle against the old regime a traitor to the cause of the proletariat, for encouraging the conception that this government, a bourgeois government, could carry through the interests of the workers. Indeed, when Pravda later published this letter, the only letter from afar that it actually published, the editors removed several passages, including this one. They clearly understood the significance of what Lenin was writing. Lee dismisses the obvious interpretation of Kamenev's article, the support for the provisional government, as the product of inattentive readers who have simply not read the entire editorial. The editorial later states, according to Lee's translation, that, quote, the paths of the democratic forces and of the provisional government will diverge, that when the bourgeoisie comes to its senses, it will inevitably attempt to halt the revolutionary movement and not permit it to develop to the point of satisfying the essential needs of the proletariat and the peasantry. This full satisfaction of their demands is only possible when full and complete power is in their own hands. This is, in fact, a thoroughly Menshevik argument. Currently, the provisional government, that is the bourgeois provisional government, is carrying out revolutionary actions. They should be supported in doing so. In typically opportunist fashion, the revolutionary tasks are postponed for some indefinite future. It is, in fact, an argument to justify support for the provisional government. Lee supplements Kamenev's statement with his own explanation. Quote, the great mass of soldiers and workers newly awakened to political life still trusted the new provisional government and its seemingly excellent anti-czarist credentials. This trust was not based on a diluted burst of revolutionary good feeling, as we usually describe the situation with more than a little condescension. The fact of the matter is that in this slice of time, the Provisional Government was actually carrying out revolutionary measures, dismantling the Tsarist police apparatus, releasing political prisoners, setting up guarantees of basic political freedoms, laying the groundwork for national elections, and so forth." End quote. A clash would come, and only then would it be necessary to oppose the Provisional Government, which happened several months later. Thus, Kamenev's line, according to Lee, quote, "took the Bolsheviks all the way to October." This analysis is false from beginning to end. The new government, in fact, did not have seemingly excellent anti-Tsarist credentials. It had sought to preserve the autocracy at all costs. The masses of workers and soldiers did not look to the Provisional Government to carry out revolutionary measures, but rather to the Soviet, led by political parties that were trying to encourage support for the Provisional Government. For Lenin and for Trotsky, the task was to sharpen the political differentiation, to encourage absolute distrust in the government and in figures like Kerensky, not to counsel illusions that the government would carry out democratic reforms, abolish the monarchy, and end the war. In making his claims, Lee completely ignores the most fundamental issue involved in the conflict within the Bolshevik Party in March, that of the war itself. He ignores the many editorials and articles that appeared in March in which Kamenev and Stalin adopted a defensist position on the war, corresponding to their support for the Provisional Government. A March 15th editorial written by Kamenev under the headline, "Without Secret Diplomacy," is a thoroughly Menshevik article. Again, he writes, "This is the beginning. The war continues. The great Russian Revolution has not stopped it. And no one nourishes hopes that it will end tomorrow or the day after. Russia's soldiers, peasants, and workers who want to end war, who went to war at the call of the overthrown Tsar and who shed their blood under his banners have freed themselves, and the Tsarist banners have been replaced by the red banners of the revolution." That is, the war has been transformed into a revolutionary war, now that the Provisional Government is leading it. The same line, in fact, which was promoted by the Mensheviks and Socialist revolutionaries. Kamenev wrote, quote, "When army faces army, the most absurd policy would be to propose that one of them lay down its arms and return to its homes. This policy would not be a policy of peace, but a policy of enslavement, a policy which a free people must indignantly reject. No, it would firmly stand at its post, answering bullet with bullet and shell with shell. This is imperative," end quote. Demonstrating abject prostration before the Allied imperialist powers, he continued, "Russia is bound by alliances with England, France, and other countries. It cannot act in questions of peace apart from them. But this only means that revolutionary Russia, which has freed itself from the Tsarist yoke, must directly and openly turn to its allies with a proposal to review the question of opening peace negotiations. That is, must appeal to the imperialist powers in Europe. Our slogan is not the disorganization of the revolutionary army and the army that is becoming more revolutionary, nor is it the empty slogan, 'Down with war.' Our slogan is pressure on the Provisional Government in order to compel it to openly, before the entire worldwide democracy, and immediately attempt to induce all the warring countries to immediately open negotiations about a way to end the war. Until then, everyone should remain at his post." It concludes with a warm greeting to the appeal of the Soviet, drawn up by Sukhanov, to which I referred to earlier. That is, the question of ending the war is not a task the working class has as an independent political task, a question of power. It's a question of making an appeal to the bourgeoisie, to the imperialist powers, the bourgeois Provisional Government, to take steps towards ending the war. Kamenev's pro-war position was repeated by Stalin, despite the subsequent falsifications of the Stalinist bureaucracy. In Stalin's article of March 16th, The War, he also rejected the slogan, "Down with the war," asserting that instead, quote, "the workers, soldiers, and peasants must arrange meetings and demonstrations and demand that the Provisional Government shall come out openly and publicly in an effort to induce all the belligerent powers to start peace negotiations immediately on the basis of recognition of the right of nations to self-determination." Again, bring pressure to bear on the Provisional Government to force this bourgeois government to end the war. This government comprised and led by organizations and individuals who had been, in fact, the most fervent supporters of the war throughout its bloody course. One need only compare such statements with the writings of Lenin to see the vast political gulf. It is absolutely impermissible, Lenin wrote on March 9th, to conceal from ourselves and from the people that this government wants to continue the war, imperialist war, that it is an agent of British capital, that it wants to restore the monarchy and strengthen the rule of the landlords and capitalists. And later, on March 12th, he said, to urge the Gushkov-Milyukov government to conclude a speedy, honest, democratic, and good neighborly peace is like the good village priest, urging the landlords and the merchants to walk in the way of God, to love their neighbors, and to turn the other cheek. End quote. Lee's defense of Kamenev, and by implication Stalin, is supplemented by another position, elaborated in a report he delivered last month at the University of Michigan, that it is impossible to say that the revolution in February was a bourgeois democratic revolution and the revolution in October was a socialist revolution. This is a myth promoted by, among others, Trotsky and his followers, who have used it to suggest that prior to Lenin's return to Russia, Stalin and Kamenev intended to go no further than a bourgeois democratic revolution, while Lenin called for a socialist revolution in his April theses. Instead, all of 1917 should be understood as an anti-bourgeois democratic revolution, he says. Lee asserts that the aim of a socialist revolution was in fact not even part of the Bolshevik message throughout 1917. The assertion that the Bolsheviks did not advance the socialist program is disproven by an analysis of party documents, including the April conference that followed Lenin's return. The editors of Pravda were under no illusions about the significance of Lenin's proposals. They wrote on April 8th, after the publication of Lenin's April theses, "As for the general scheme of Comrade Lenin, it seems to us unacceptable in that it starts from the assumption that the bourgeois democratic revolution is ended and counts upon an immediate transfer of this revolution into a socialist revolution." They were certainly not under the illusion that Lenin's proposals didn't have anything to do with socialism. In the impending catastrophe and how to combat it, written in September 1917, Lenin, in the section titled "Can we go forward if we fear to advance to socialism?" Lenin argues against the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, who claim that the revolution is purely bourgeois democratic and that it cannot implement socialist policies. Lenin states, "It is impossible to stand still in history in general, and in wartime in particular. We must either advance or retreat. It is impossible in the 20th century Russia, which has won a republic and a democracy in a revolutionary way, to go forward without advancing towards socialism, without taking steps towards it. The dialectics of history is such that the war, by extraordinarily expediting the transformation of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism, has thereby extraordinarily advanced mankind towards socialism." While I cannot address the issue in detail in this lecture, the last quote points to the conditions, I think, that brought Lenin and Trotsky together theoretically, programmatically, and politically. The imperialist war had exposed the contradictions of capitalism as a world system, revealed the interconnection of the fate of the working class as an international class. It was not a question of a national bourgeois democratic revolution, but, to refer back to the quote from Lenin at the end of Comrade Nick's lecture 2 weeks ago, it was a question of turning, quote, "the imperialist war into a civil war of the oppressed against the oppressors for the attainment of socialism." The falsifications of Lee confirm once again that the history of the Russian Revolution is of enormous contemporary significance. So many times in the history of the 20th century, the revolutionary upheavals of the working class were subordinated, particularly through the treachery of the Stalinists, to the bourgeoisie. In China in 1927, Spain in the 1930s, India and Indochina in the 1940s, throughout Europe after the war, Indonesia in the 1960s, and Chile and Latin America in the 1970s, Iran in 1979, countless other examples throughout Africa and the Middle East, all the way through to Egypt in 2011. These basic questions are posed, that is, the political independence of the working class and the fight for political power, the questions that were posed in Russia in 1917. Today, as we enter a new period of war and revolution, the parties of the upper middle class are doing everything they can to block the development of an independent movement of the working class for socialism. What made the Russian Revolution so unique, it was the only of its kind, was the existence of a revolutionary leadership headed by Lenin and Trotsky that guided the revolutionary uprisings of the working class to its necessary conclusion, the conquest of state power. The next stage in this struggle, Lenin's return to Russia, and the April Theses, is the subject of the next lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that very comprehensive and detailed lecture. We have questions which have come in. Before we take these questions, we'll first of all give Joe a bit of a breathing space. And this is a good time for you to make purchases of literature. There are many books which are being featured. My favorite is The Unfinished 20th Century. So you can purchase that, and there are other books, of course, which are available. If you have not purchased the Tsar to Lenin, this great 20th century documentary is available. I want to stress to our international listeners that Tsar to Lenin, this video contains subtitles in many, many languages. So it is really a documentary which you're able to follow and enjoy. And of course, we want to urge you to make a donation to the World Socialist website to assist in its publications and in the work of the editorial board of the World Socialist website. But we have now questions coming in. I'll just look at them quickly. The first question, which I think would be helpful to review, is one from Vivi. Could you explain what the relationship between the Soviet and the Duma was in the aftermath of the revolution? You said that both of these new governments were formed in the same building around the same time. But to what extent did they work with each other? Was there a power structure? Was there a power structure or division of labor in place?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Vivi, for that question. I think it's a raises important question, which is, again, it gets to the heart of the issue of the dual power that developed after the February events, or in the midst of the February events. The short answer is there was a close relationship between the Duma committee and the Soviet Executive Committee. A couple points should be made about the way in which the Soviet itself was established and developed. Trotsky makes the point in the history of the Russian Revolution that there was a real difference between the Soviet as it emerged in the 1905 revolution, which was reviewed by Comrade Fred a couple weeks ago, or last month, and the way in which the Soviet emerged in 1917. The Soviet in 1905 very much came out of and was a direct expression of a revolutionary strike wave, the general strike. It emerged very much as sort of a workers' committee. The Soviet in 1917 had a somewhat different character in its origins, in that it was, in fact, the question of the Soviet was very much embedded in the consciousness of the Petrograd workers. And there were all sorts of calls for the formation of the Soviet, even in, very early on in the revolutionary events, 23rd, 24th, 25th. There were calls coming from the Viborg Committee and other sections of workers for the formation of Soviets. They had recalled the experiences of 1905. The Soviet, as it actually developed in the Taurida Palace, came out of the initiative of Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries after they had been liberated from prison on the 26th and 27th. And the sort of character of the formation of the Soviet was impacted by the fact that it really, the revolution had sort of succeeded, particularly due to the revolt of the soldiers. The Tsar's apparatus collapsed with the insurrection of the soldiers by the fifth day. Had succeeded before the working class had established and developed organizations through the process of struggle. So the Soviet, therefore, developed initially in the sense from the initiative of above, and particularly by the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries. And again, they dominated the leadership of the executive committee when it first was formed and elected, although there were also Bolshevik representatives on the executive committee, and then others were brought forward. But the dominant political force were the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries. And they developed very quickly close ties to the Duma committee, which, as I said, had been established the same day. I would note, actually, even the question of the location of the Soviet was an issue. There was, in fact, a leaflet. It's not clear, there's some debate historically on who wrote the leaflet, calling for the formation of a Soviet at Finland Station. It would be organized at Finland Station, that is, at the Viborg, in the Viborg district. It was very much an industrial working class area. There was a call. There's some historians who say that this was issued by the local Bolshevik organization in the Viborg district, calling for this formation of a Soviet there at the Finland Station. There was, in fact, a local Soviet which then developed, but it was seen as an auxiliary to the Soviet to the Taurida Palace. There's others who say that the call for the formation of the Soviet at the Finland Station was made by the Mezheriansi, that is the interdistrict group that associated with Trotsky. In any case, the Soviet was formed. It was dominated by the political organizations of the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, which spoke principally on behalf of sections of the petty bourgeoisie, professional classes in the cities, the left wing of the liberal bourgeoisie to a certain extent, with the Mensheviks having a base of support among workers and pretty more privileged workers, and the socialist revolutionaries having a broader base among the peasantry. But they forged a close alliance with the Provisional Government, with the Duma. There was established very early on a liaison committee. Kerensky, who I mentioned in the report, was the only member of the Soviet Executive Committee who also became a member of the Provisional Government. In fact, Lenin refers to Kerensky as that little braggart, which I think is perhaps an apt characterization. The Soviet Executive Committee, and this was according to the leadership or the theory of the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, particularly the Mensheviks. The theory was this was a bourgeois revolution, therefore the bourgeoisie should rule, and the representatives of the Soviet should not in fact participate in the government. That was a sort of rule that had been established by the Soviet Executive Committee early on in its period. This wasn't really a expression of protest, but rather of the insistence that the bourgeoisie should control state power. Provisional government would be a bourgeois government. Kerensky was in fact the only one who joined both. He burst into the Soviet Executive Committee at one point early on and declared, "Comrades, do you trust me?" and pleaded with them to agree to his participation in the bourgeois government, the Provisional Government, as Minister of Justice. I don't think there's actually a record of a vote on this question, but then he went and he was a member of the Socialist Revolutionaries, although he'd actually been a member of a breakaway faction, a right-wing breakaway faction. He was actually a member of the Duma earlier on and during the war period, in fact. So he was one of those that during the February events was pleading to the bourgeoisie to take some sort of action, to form some sort of government, to do something in order to prevent things from getting out of control. So the short answer is that they under the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, they had a close relationship. And this was, again, the paradoxical character of dual power. The Soviet of Workers and Peasants Deputies was the political power to which the masses of workers and soldiers in Petrograd looked. That was their body, but it was led by individuals who were insisting that not that they take power, but that the bourgeoisie take power. And that was sort of the character. And as I noted in the lecture, the real sort of class conflict represented by these two political organizations, the Soviet and the Provisional Government, really expressed itself directly only when the Bolsheviks took control of the Soviets in later on in the course of the revolution.
There is another question. Let me see if I can just find it, because can you explain a bit more about how Lenin came over to Trotsky's conception of the permanent revolution between 1905 and February of 1917? Was there frequent correspondence between the two?
Well, that's a complex question. I mean, there wasn't frequent correspondence in the form of letters between Trotsky and Lenin between the two revolutions. There was a vigorous and as they say, frank and comradely debate over many political questions during that period.
I'm not so sure that it was always very comradely.
Yeah, well, that's the implication. Yes, it was frank. There was I should rephrase it, there was a very sharp political conflict. And of course, one should make the point that, and Trotsky acknowledged this later on, that in his own appraisal of the significance of the division in 1903, which led to the formation of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, he underestimated the significance of the conflict. His position, he was not a Menshevik. Contrary to the mythology of the Stalinists, he developed an independent position, and he was very critical, as we saw in some of what I wrote. He was particularly critical of the Mensheviks and their theory, their counter-revolutionary theory of the revolution, but he sought and was critical of Lenin on organizational questions, and also, of course, theoretical questions, which also I reviewed. And he at various times sought to encourage and develop a unity movement of the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. There was an underestimation on his part of the social significance and class significance of the conflict between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And this was particularly Lenin's great genius, more than anyone else, to see the significance of the reflection within the party. And I'm here referring to the conflicts that developed in 1903 and led to the split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. To see in the divisions within the party the conflict of social forces, and to foresee in such an extraordinary way the far-reaching implications of the issues that were fought out in 1903. So there were differences on numerous issues, including on the theory of the Russian Revolution itself, which I reviewed. I mean, in terms of what, and again, I think this is something which has to be studied very carefully. And it's certainly a project to be undertaken. The circumstances which produced the coming together of the theoretical conceptions of Lenin and Trotsky, both before February and after February, and there was a development in both. That is, a development of Lenin's conception both before and after. But I think there's without doubt it's clear that there was a coming together, and particularly that Lenin adopted and developed a conception of the revolution that corresponded to Trotsky's theory, and that was understood. I mean, when he returned, and Comrade James, I'm sure, will address this issue in his lecture, when he returned in April and raised the call for all power to the Soviets, the beginning of the transition to socialism, the beginning of workers' control of production, the next stage of the revolution, criticized what he called the old Bolshevik slogan of the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. It was understood that he was adopting positions that had been associated with Trotskyism, and or with Trotsky, and he was in that sense the first Trotskyist. I think Trotsky makes that point somewhere. So it was clear that he was coming over to Trotsky's position. What were the circumstances behind that? What led to that? I think that, as I said at the end, I think that the issue of the imperialist war had a major impact in underscoring and this, of course, was brought into and reviewed by Comrade Nick Beams 2 weeks ago. The character of the imperialist war really exposed the crisis of the world nation-state system. It was not a question. I mean, I think this what I cited from Trotsky from 1915. Let's see if I can find it again, which I thought was an extraordinary statement. This was from the essay "The Struggle for Power," written in June of 1915, where he says that there is deep interconnection between the two, between the end of national wars and the end of national revolutions. We are living in the era of imperialism, which means not only a system of colonial expansion, but also a very distinctive type of domestic regime. It is no longer a matter of a bourgeois nation opposing an old regime, but of the proletariat opposing the bourgeois nation. That was a conception that was very much also developed by Lenin. The other consequence of the imperialist war was to really sharpen and clarify the character of the division with opportunism, the way in which, which Comrade Nick reviewed, all the all the parties of the Second International voted for war credits, Germany and France in particular, it really underscored the immense political gulf between national opportunism and international proletarian Marxism. And I think these are some of the issues which really sort of brought the theoretical conceptions of Lenin and Trotsky together. Just finally, I would note when I referred to this quote from Trotsky's "Our Differences," written in 1909, where he speaks about the asceticism of the Bolshevik perspective and how the consequences of the Bolshevik line would emerge and become a serious threat only in the event of victory. There's actually a footnote in the 1922 version in which that essay appears, in which Trotsky says, "This threat, as we know, never materialized because under the leadership of Comrade Lenin, the Bolsheviks changed their policy line on this most important matter, not without inner struggle, in the spring of 1917, that is, before the seizure of power." It's really that question which Lee is seeking to oppose, and why it's so significant. The notion that there was a change in the policy of the Bolshevik Party and in the line that Lenin was fighting for, and that there was a struggle over that line in April 1917, which was a necessary foundation for the conquest of political power in October. That is, that was the necessary theoretical and political basis for the October Revolution. That is what he's arguing against. And that's why it's essentially a neo-Stalinist line. That is to say that, in opposition to the theory of permanent revolution, that the question was of national bourgeois revolutions. That was the line which was developed first in socialism in one country, and then in countless betrayal, one after the next, throughout the 1930s, in which they subordinated the proletariat to the bourgeoisie on the grounds of all sorts of conceptions, the block of four classes, and that the revolutionary bourgeoisie was progressive, and the national bourgeoisie was progressive and revolutionary. In countless questions, that issue was became the shipwreck of revolution.
There's another question which, how significant, it's been partially answered, but how significant was the experience of the February Revolution in 1917 in converting Lenin's perspective? Was February 1917 the most important experience for Lenin, or was it merely one among many factors of his political development during the previous 12 years? such as his relentless struggles against the betrayals of the Second International in respect of the imperialist war, his concept of self-determination in relation to the oppressed nationalities within the Roman Empire, or any other factors?
Well, I guess I've partially discussed that. I think the February Revolution did have a big impact. One of the, I think, is sort of reviewing some of these writings and Trotsky's writings in particular on these questions. One of the elements which is most striking is Trotsky's analysis of the logic of the class struggle and the conflict of social forces. And that's very much tied to his theory of permanent revolution. When he talks, for example, about what would the proletariat do upon taking state power? Could one imagine that it would not make inroads into capitalist property relations? That having taken state power, it wouldn't begin introducing socialism? What would happen if the capitalists locked out the workers and demanded cuts in wages? Would the working class government would the working class government simply not carry out measures against the capitalists? There's one quote which I wanted to cite in relationship to this, because he had a very sensuous conception of the logic of the class struggle and different social forces, rather than a mechanical sort of notion. This was very much present in his critique of the Menshevik position. But just in relationship to this point about the impact of the February Revolution, he says, and this is in Our Differences, again, from 1909. He's talking about the position of Lassalle. He says, realistic wisdom, which in Lassalle is still covered with a film of idealism, he's approving of a comment by Lassalle, appears in Marx as materialist dialectics. Its whole force consists in the fact that it does not oppose its sensible tactics to the real movement of the masses, but only formulates, purifies, and generalizes that movement. Just because revolution tears the veil of mystery from the true face of the social structure, just because it brings the classes into conflict in the broad political arena, the Marxist politician feels that revolution is his natural element. What then are these sensible Menshevik tactics that cannot be implemented? Or worse still, that ascribe their own failure to the fever of revolution and deliberately wait for the fever to pass, that is to say, for the revolutionary energy of the masses to be exhausted or mechanically crushed. I think the significant point which I wanted to raise in relationship to that quote is his point about a revolution sort of lifting the veil he says, tears the veil of mystery from the true face of the social structure. And I think there was an element of that in the process of what happened in February. It did, in some sense, lift the veil on the different social forces and pose very starkly basic political questions. And Lenin answered and responded to that very, very clearly. As I said, immediately, his response on the March 3rd, distrust above all Kerensky, no support for the Provisional Government. This is a government of the capitalists and the landlords. The conception that the next stage of the revolution, very immediately, that was the understanding of what had to happen, and it corresponded very directly with Trotsky's conception. So I think that the development of the revolution, the logic of the revolution, both Lenin and Trotsky were very much in their element in revolution, contrary, I would say, to Kamenev. That really did contribute to bringing them together and clarifying political issues and in preparing the political struggles that led up to October.
We have a number of questions which are oriented more to the contemporary situation. One of these asks, is it fair to say there are comparisons between the February Revolution and the 2011 revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia? Why didn't these revolutions lead to socialism?
It's an important question. I alluded to, I don't know if that question came in before my allusion at the end or after. I think that there is significant similarities or a commonality of issues that are raised in these revolutions separated by nearly a century. We very much live, as Comrade North has stressed many times, in the unfinished 20th century and the central political problems which confronted masses of people and the workers at the beginning of the 20th century confront us in some sense at an even higher level today. But I think there are very important issues which, and you know, you can read. We wrote a number of perspectives on the World Socialist website, including one recently, which I think drew the parallel between the events in Egypt and the Russian Revolution, and it made the point that what was revealed in the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. I mean, that was an immense. It was a revolution, immense striving of masses. I would say perhaps one difference was that, I mean, the working class played a very significant role in the Egyptian events, although it didn't really begin as a working class movement in the same way that the February Revolution did. But the working class emerged in the course of the revolution. The question of strikes became increasingly important, and that was really what ultimately forced, as the uprising developed and wasn't, it wasn't responding to violence by the masses weren't responding by violence by going home. They got larger and larger. That was ultimately what forced I'm not quite sure if abdication is the right word, but it perhaps is, of Mubarak, who had been in power for 4 decades and was backed by the United States. And the response of the Obama administration initially to these events was to support Mubarak. It ultimately felt that in order to contain the situation, they felt that it was necessary. In a similar way, actually, to the way in which, again, there's obviously differences, but in a similar way to the way in which the bourgeois parties, after seeing that the revolutionary movement in Petrograd was not being contained, turned to the military staff and said, all right, in order to contain the situation, preserve the war, and preserve the basic framework of the state. And at that time, their conception was actually that they were going to even preserve the autocracy, except it would be transferred from Nicholas II to his brother, that it was necessary to have the Tsar deposed. And they did that. And I didn't go into this in the lecture, but that very much precipitated the abdication of the Tsar with the intervention of the military. In any case, in the February events, you had a certain rhyming parallel process in which Mubarak was forced out. But again, I mean, I think the basic issue which arises in considering the comparison is that there do not exist in Egypt a revolutionary party. And what does one have now, more than 5 years, well now 6 years, after the uprising in Egypt that forced the departure of Mubarak in February 2011. I mean, you have a military government, essentially the same state structure. You have Mubarak, who's just been, pardoned or acquitted or released from prison. I mean, you have basically the same basic framework. And why is that? It isn't a result of the fact that masses in Egypt didn't want to fight. It's the product of the absence of a political leadership. And in particular, within that context, the role of what we call pseudo-left organizations, the Revolutionary Socialists, which is the international affiliate, or the Egyptian affiliate of the International Socialist Organization, played a critical role in channeling opposition, first behind the Muslim Brotherhood, then behind the military, then behind the Muslim Brotherhood again. It was zigzagging on their part, but they worked very deliberately, and their policy always coincided with that of the State Department in channeling opposition and preventing an independent movement of the working class. But more broadly, there was an absence of revolutionary leadership, and that's the basic issue. I think that's the basic question which comes out of a study of the Russian Revolution, how critical it was. I think Comrade North said in the first lecture on this series, I don't have the quote before me, but he made the point that one of the central issues in understanding and studying the Russian Revolution is that it shows how critical the issue of revolutionary leadership is. That without that leadership, the revolution would not have been successful. And and one sees that in the whole course of the events from February to October.
Well, that partially answers a question which did come up. Can you please elaborate how the strategic lessons of the Bolshevik Party informed the approach the SEP takes to differentiating itself from political tendencies which it refers to as pseudo-left. I think.
How the strategic lessons of the Bolshevik Party. I mean, I think this is, this is at the essence of Marxism. I would say that again, there's so many issues which arise in the study of the Russian Revolution. But if you look back at the 1850 address by Marx and Engels in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, where they speak about the difference between the interests of the proletariat and the democratic petty bourgeoisie. Let me just find that if I can. Unfortunately, I have too many notes, and finding the correct correct page is sometimes a challenge. But he says, he and Marx and Engels, in their address to the Central Committee of the Communist League, make the point, and again, this was drawing out of the lessons of 1848, the importance of sharply differentiating the political divisions between the proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie. And he makes a point that they make the point that the petty bourgeoisie wants to make society more comfortable for itself. The proletariat wants to transform all social relations, to upend the capitalist system, to take control of production, to establish socialism. And in that context, he speaks about that it's necessary to raise on the banner not unity with the democratic petty bourgeoisie, but the permanent revolution in permanence. That is, that the working class has to take part. So these questions of the political conflict, to differentiate and clarify the line of the working class, the interests of the working class, is continuously at issue. And the preparation for October in 1917, the necessary preparation was to sharply clarify political issues, to differentiate, and on that basis elaborate the independent perspective for the working class that involved a political conflict within the Bolshevik Party in opposition to the line of Kamenev and Stalin in March. And of course, it very much is, there's differences, certainly. And we're talking about the pseudo-left. We've made this point in many of our articles, the enormous rightward transformation of the so-called left, and that's why we use the word pseudo-left. I think that there has been a significant transformation.
Well, if I can make a point about that, frankly, even if when one speaks of the pseudo-left today, they can't even be compared, except in the most tangential sense, even to the Mensheviks. What, at the most fundamental levels, distinguishes the International Committee and its sections from all of these organizations, or from what generally calls itself left today, is that we're the only tendency which actually bases itself on a class analysis of society. I would urge, as we always do, our listeners and supporters, please read their press, read their websites. All of them begin with the assumption, more or less, that the working class is not the basic revolutionary force in society. The political development of the working class as such is of no interest to them. They are oriented to the bourgeois parties. They seek to influence these parties. The question of the independent political role of the working class does not even arise. The issue of revolutionary perspective or program does not even arise. These are organizations which, if you were thinking of the sort of a family tree, they broke so long ago. The evolutionary line of these organizations is so distant from Bolshevism and Marxism and that tradition that it really, to be blunt, we speak a completely different language. There is a question, and I'll take that up and give Joe just one question has come in. Lars Lee made his name initially with a book analyzing Lenin's What Is to Be Done. Could you comment on this work? Did Lee's revisionism of the history of Bolshevism begin there. I think Lee's revisionism of the history of Bolshevism began when he first took up a pen or began working with a computer. I don't think he has ever written anything which can be remotely characterized as Marxist. Just to answer this, he produced a book, and we would have no objection. There are individuals who are serious scholars. They may not be Marxists, but they do produce material which is very valuable empirically, is the result of significant research. Certainly, Alexander Rabinovich is the most outstanding example of that presently. He's often referred to, even among bourgeois historians, as among the last of the great narrative historians. We've also made use of the work of Rex Wade, which has, I think, follows somewhat in that same school. And there are significant academics whose work we frequently make use of. Larsley is not in that category. He exemplifies a certain type of history which one comes, or pseudo-history, if I could use the word pseudo again, that one comes across among those who are influenced by the concept that you sort of make up a historical narrative. And it has a form of unseriousness which is really takes one's breath away. I mean, if I would give an example of someone who would write, and I think this is very typical of the method they use. Let's say if you were going to write about the American Revolution, and you want to use a style very much prevalent among postmodernists and the invention of narrative or deconstructing history, you will say something like, well, up until now there was this common conception that the Declaration of Independence officially formalized the separation of the colonies from England. However, this is not really the case. In fact, the Declaration of Independence was a last-ditch effort by the slave owner Jefferson and the womanizer Franklin and the priggish Adams to prevent independence and strengthen the bonds between England and the North American colonies. What's the evidence for that? Well, there is no evidence for that. You just said it and you created a new narrative. This type of method is very frequently found, or is found in Lee's writings. One of his, he will announce, for example, that he's, as he did in his book on what is to be done, that he's undertaken a new translation. And so rather, he'll say there's been a misunderstanding of what Lenin meant when he used the word trade unionism. And he'll say no, and he'll then translate, he'll use the word TRED, trade unionism, and tell you that this is something completely different than what most people have interpreted Lenin's use of the word trade unionism to mean. Unfortunately, in What Is to Be Done, Lenin also uses the word in German, nur Gewerkschaftlerei. In What Is to Be Done, however, from a political and theoretical standpoint, he insists, and he refers to the scandalous passage in What Is to Be Done. What he finds most objectionable is the claim, and this is the great error Lenin made, that Marxism must be brought into the working class. That is absolutely unacceptable, and so much of his book, which makes an excellent doorstop if you're in need of such a device, is centered on that.
One, I would say.
Well, you have to speak to the publisher about that. But again, just to come back to the just more about, just to underline or underscore what Joe has been speaking about, his interpretation of the Russian Revolution is a neo-Stalinist interpretation. It sets out to discredit what they call the narrative of the Russian Revolution associated with Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution. That's what they set out to disprove. Or not so much disprove, but simply reject. They don't really create, however, a new interpretation of history. They simply revive the discredited and dishonest, falsified history of the Russian Revolution along the lines of the Stalinists. There is nothing really in his interpretation of history which isn't to be found in the 1924 debate that erupted in response to Trotsky's Lessons of October. By that point, Lenin had died, and Trotsky had written Lessons of October in 1924 in order to review the critical experience of the revolution, and it was done in response to the defeat of the German Revolution in 1923 and the failure of the German Communist Party to prepare for the revolution and to adjust and change its practice in line with the momentum and logic of revolutionary developments. And Trotsky begins that extraordinary pamphlet by stating that there has been an inadequate study of the Russian Revolution. And so he reviews the major experiences of 1924, and of course that involves both an examination of the differences which had arisen in March, and above all in October itself, when Kamenev and Zinoviev opposed the seizure of power. Well, this brought about a bitter eruption of an invective against Trotsky, and the argument which they sought to make was that Trotsky totally misrepresented what had happened in 1917, that in fact the leaders such as Kamenev and others had a revolutionary line, and they didn't need to learn anything from Trotsky and his so-called theory of permanent revolution, which by then was being treated as a great heresy. In other words, what Lee is doing is essentially reviving those arguments. Now again, to underscore, I think, a very critical point, when we discuss this, these historical questions have profound contemporary relevance in response to the question of Egypt. That was yet another revolution in which the total incapacity of the bourgeoisie to carry through any democratic task whatsoever was demonstrated. Not that it had to be demonstrated again. That had already been proven back in the 1950s by the Nasserites and the policies which they pursued between 1954 through Nasser's death to Sadat and then to Mubarak and so on. In fact, the entire catastrophic situation in the Middle East is largely bound up with the betrayals of Stalinism, the subordination of the working class to a supposedly revolutionary section of the national bourgeoisie. All of that was, in fact, that entire Stalinist line, which formed the basis of the practice of communist parties in all the underdeveloped countries, was essentially a revival of the old Menshevik two-stage line. First the democratic revolution, then the socialist revolution. Now, with certain adaptations, or what is the relevance of this issue today? Well, here in the 21st century, there can no longer be any discussion of a revolutionary bourgeoisie. The world economy requires the international unification of the working class in the socialist revolution. There can be no question that the objective conditions don't exist which would permit the establishment of socialism. Nevertheless, without providing any analysis, the argument is made, or what is advanced again and again, is a political line which subordinates the working class to one or another section of the bourgeoisie. So here in the United States, it's to the Democratic Party. In England, it's to the Labour Party under Corbyn. The question of the formation of an independent party of the working class to fight for power is completely excluded. So these issues which we are discussing when we deal with the Russian Revolution remain of immense contemporary significance. The theory of permanent revolution is the contemporary theory of world socialist revolution. It's the only strategic basis upon which the struggle for power can be undertaken. Is there any final point, Joe, you'd like to make?
Well, I think probably that's the last of our questions, but I just to add on, or one additional point, which I agree very much with the points just made. I mean, I think in relationship to the issue of what is to be done, as noted, I mean, he goes after what he calls the scandalous passages in what is to be done, and really the aim is to sort of diminish, and he very much uses a sort of wordplay and everything about the nature, the word spontaneous and this sort of thing. It's worth a detailed examination. But the aim is to really the basic aim is to diminish the significance of Lenin's struggle for socialist consciousness. That is the fight of the party, the fight to educate the working class. And this was a theme which I was going to bring into the lecture. I didn't really have time or space, but if you think about the question of spontaneous and conscious, when Trotsky says that the February Revolution was led for the most part by workers educated by the party of Lenin, well, that wasn't just a sort of accident. I mean, the Bolsheviks devoted enormous effort to educating the working class. Propaganda, and you read what is to be done, the carrying out of propaganda, exposures, the role of the All-Russia newspaper, which, by the way, is the parallel of the role with the World Socialist website today, is to educate the working class, to bring into it an understanding, the development, not to diminish the significance of the class struggle itself, but that socialist consciousness does not arise organically from that class struggle. It has to be brought into it. That's the role of the party. And that was an issue which was stressed over and over again. And Lenin, of course, was attacked, and he's still attacked by the state capitalist tendencies, the anarchists, and everyone else. This was elitism and this sort of thing. No, in fact, it was only through that Lenin was fighting for the independent political line for the working class. And those who diminish the significance of that, and there are so many of them today, in fact, their political line is the working class shouldn't have an independent political line. That's for the bourgeoisie. And that's what they work against. And I think that question, I mean, we are, and that of course is again one of the central lessons of the Russian Revolution. It's also a central lesson for today. I mean, there is no doubt that there's mass development of mass opposition. We see that all over the world, the consequences of imperialist war will be devastating. You have the growth of social inequality, growing opposition in every country. The issue of really building a political leadership is the central issue.
Well, we're going to be bringing this session to a conclusion. Again, I want to, first of all, thank Comrade Joe for the very comprehensive lecture. The next lecture will take place on May 6th, and it will be given by James Cogan, and it will examine in great detail the political struggle which largely claims never took place. But I'm sure that James will have no difficulty filling up an hour explaining what actually happened. So please make sure you attend that. Next Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, there will be the online rally celebrating May Day 2017. It's the centenary May Day, of course, and all the issues of the Russian Revolution and the issues which were raised in May Day 1917 held in the midst of war. We are holding this May Day under conditions where, of course, there are wars being waged, but of course we face now the danger of the eruption of a global war which, if it were to occur, would have absolutely staggering consequences. So the rally is critical in developing a worldwide movement of the working class and youth and students against war. So finally, this is your last chance. Make purchases of literature today. Make a donation before you sign off. And don't forget to attend next week's rally. Thank you very much.